Around his neck, for most of his adult life, Louis Armstrong wore a Star of David, not hidden under his shirt but visible, resting against his chest where anyone who looked could see it. Reporters would ask him about it. Why would a black Baptist man from New Orleans wear a Jewish religious symbol? And Louis would smile that famous smile and tell them about a family named Karnoffsky. A Russian Jewish immigrant family who had taken in a 7-year-old black child in 1908, in the Jim Crow South, when such a thing could get you killed. Who had fed him when he was starving, protected him when he was vulnerable, and bought him his first musical instrument when no one else believed a poor black child deserved such an investment. The story Louis told was simple and beautiful, but what he usually didn't mention, what made the story more complicated and more meaningful, was why the Karnoffskys understood what it meant to be hunted, why they recognized in young Louis something of their own experience, why two groups of people who weren't supposed to see each other as equals somehow built a bond that would last a lifetime. New Orleans, 1908. Louis Armstrong was 7 years old and essentially on his own. His father had abandoned the family. His mother, Mayanne, was working as much as she could, which meant she was often absent, leaving Louis to fend for himself in one of the most dangerous neighborhoods in the city. The area where they lived, a section that would later be called Storyville, was controlled by violence and poverty. Children didn't have childhoods there, they had survival strategies. Louis learned early how to hustle, how to avoid danger, how to find food when there was none at home. Sang on street corners for pennies. He ran errands for prostitutes and gamblers. He did whatever it took to eat another day. Hunger was Louis's constant companion, not the mild discomfort of missing a meal, but the deep, gnawing, desperate hunger that makes a child willing to do almost anything for food. He would later remember this period of his life with a clarity that never faded, the memory of that hunger shaping everything he would become. It taught him that survival required creativity, that you couldn't wait for help to arrive, that the world was fundamentally indifferent to whether you lived or died. At 7 years old, Louis Armstrong already understood what many people never learn, that you are on your own, and if you're going to make it, you have to fight for every inch. The Karnoffsky family had arrived in New Orleans a few years earlier, fleeing pogroms in Russia where Jewish communities were being systematically attacked, their homes burned, their families murdered. Morris Karnoffsky and his wife Bess had escaped with almost nothing, carrying their children and whatever possessions they could grab, making their way across Europe and then across the ocean to America. They had been promised that America was different, that here they could work hard and build a life without fear of being killed for their religion. What they found was more complicated. Yes, there was opportunity, but there was also hatred, discrimination, suspicion, signs in windows saying "No Jews," jobs they were denied because of their last name, neighbors who made it clear they weren't welcome. The Karnoffskys started a junk collection business, the kind of work that required no credentials, no approval from gatekeepers. They bought a horse and wagon and drove through neighborhoods collecting scrap metal, old rags, bottles, anything that could be sold to recyclers. It was hard, unglamorous work that put them at the bottom of New Orleans's economic ladder. But it was work, and it kept them alive, and it didn't require them to hide who they were. Morris would drive the wagon while calling out in his heavy accent, advertising that he would buy junk. And people would bring out their discarded items, some treating the Karnoffskys with respect, others with open contempt, making jokes about Jewish merchants, about them being cheap, about them being different. Louis first encountered the Karnoffskys on one of his wandering days, when hunger had driven him out searching for any opportunity. He heard Morris calling out from the wagon and approached, asking if there was any work he could do. Morris looked at this tiny, skinny black child, saw the desperation in his eyes, the hunger in the way he held himself, and recognized something familiar. This was a child who knew what it meant to be unwanted, to be at the mercy of a world that saw him as less than human. Morris spoke with Bess that evening. They had very little money. Taking on an employee, even a child who would work for almost nothing, was a financial strain they could barely afford. But Bess said something that would change Louis's life. He needs help. We needed help once. We help him. The next morning, Louis showed up at the Karnoffsky home and Morris gave him a job. Louis would ride on the junk wagon, help collect items, sort materials, make himself useful however he could. In exchange, Morris would pay him a few cents a day, but more importantly, Bess would feed him. Not leftovers, not scraps, real meals, the same food the Karnoffsky children ate. Louis would later describe those meals as the most important part of the arrangement. To sit at a table, to be treated like he belonged there, to have adults care whether he was eating enough, this was completely foreign to his experience. His own mother loved him, but she was barely surviving herself, and there wasn't enough of anything to go around, including attention and care. Working for the Karnoffskys, Louis encountered a kind of dignity he hadn't known existed for people like him. Morris treated him not as a servant or a charity case, but as a worker deserving of respect. When Louis did his job well, Morris praised him. When Louis made mistakes, Morris corrected him patiently, explaining what needed to be done. Differently, this might seem unremarkable, but for a black child in 1908 New Orleans, being treated with basic human respect by a white family was radical. The racial hierarchy was absolute and brutal. Black children were expected to defer to all white people, to accept insults and abuse without response, to understand that their lives mattered less. But the Karnoffskys, perhaps because they too existed outside the accepted social order, didn't operate according to those rules. As weeks turned into months, Louis became more than an employee. He became part of the family's daily life. Bess would teach him Yiddish phrases, laughing at his pronunciation. The Karnoffsky children would play with Louis during breaks from work. Morris would tell him stories about Russia, about fleeing persecution, about building a new life in a country that didn't necessarily want them, and Louis, who had never had anyone talk to him like his thoughts and feelings mattered, absorbed these stories, these lessons, this model of what family could look like even when it wasn't connected by blood. The neighborhood noticed. Of course they noticed. A white family treating a black child like family was offensive to the racial order that governed Southern life. Other white residents would make comments to Morris, suggesting he was being foolish, that you couldn't trust black people, that Louis would steal from them or worse. Morris would respond in his broken English that Louis was a good boy, a hard worker, and that he trusted him completely. Black neighbors had different concerns. Some worried that Louis was being exploited, that the Karnoffskys were using him for cheap labor while pretending to be kind. Others worried about what would happen when the inevitable confrontation came, because white people helping black people always seemed to end badly for the black people involved. But the relationship continued and deepened. Louis started spending more time at the Karnoffsky home than at his own. When his mother couldn't be found, which happened increasingly often, Louis would sleep at the Karnoffskys, and Bess would make him a bed and tell him he was safe there. When other children would mock Louis for his dark skin or his poverty, the Karnoffsky children would defend him, creating alliances that violated every social convention of the era. And when Louis expressed interest in music, when he would sing while working and show a natural sense of rhythm and melody, Morris and Bess recognized something worth nurturing. The cornet changed everything, Louis had heard. Music his whole life, New Orleans was saturated with it, but he'd never imagined he could create it himself. Instruments cost money, and money was something he'd never had. But Morris and Bess had been saving a small amount from their business, and they made a decision that Louis would remember for the rest of his life. They took Louis to a pawn shop and bought him a used cornet, $5, an amount that was significant to the Karnoffskys' strained finances, but that they spent without hesitation. Morris handed the instrument to Louis and said something Louis would quote for decades: "This is your future. You practice, you work hard, you can be something." That cornet, bought by Russian Jewish immigrants for a poor black child, became the foundation of one of the most important musical careers in history. Louis practiced obsessively. Karnoffskys would hear him playing while he worked, would encourage him, would tell him he was getting better. Bess would make him stop and eat, worried that he was practicing so intensely he was forgetting to take care of himself. Morris would bring home sheet music he'd traded for, giving Louis new songs to learn. The investment they made wasn't just financial. It was emotional, relational, built on a belief that this child's potential mattered. But the story is more complicated than simple generosity. The Karnoffskys weren't wealthy benefactors slumming in the ghetto. They were desperate immigrants barely surviving themselves, facing their own discrimination, their own struggles. When they helped Louis, they weren't operating from a position of privilege and power. They were operating from recognition, from understanding that marginalization creates bonds between unlikely people. They saw in Louis's hunger the hunger they'd felt. They saw in the contempt directed at him echoes of the contempt directed at them. They understood that systems of oppression might target different groups for different reasons, but the underlying logic, the dehumanization, was the same. This is why the story resists simple categorization. It's not a white savior narrative where privileged people rescue someone less fortunate and expect gratitude and deference in return. The Karnoffskys weren't asking Louis to be grateful or to prove his worth. They were building relationship, creating family across the boundaries that society insisted were absolute. And Louis, for his part, wasn't a passive recipient of charity. He worked, he contributed, he gave back to the family that had given to him. When Morris was sick, Louis would drive the wagon alone, bringing home money to help the family survive. When anti-Semitic customers would refuse to do business with the Karnoffskys, Louis would sometimes make the transactions himself, his blackness paradoxically making him more acceptable to some white customers than the Jewish family he worked for. The relationship taught Louis lessons that would shape his entire life and career. He learned that the racial categories Southern society insisted were natural and fixed were actually fragile and constructed. He learned that people who were supposed to be his enemies could be his family, and people who looked like him could betray him, while people who looked different could protect him. He learned that kindness wasn't about what you looked like or where you came from, but about choices you made when you didn't have to make them. Karnoffskys didn't have to help Louis, they chose to. And that choice, repeated daily over years, built something that couldn't be destroyed. When Louis eventually left New Orleans and began his career as a musician, he carried the Karnoffskys with him. Not just the Star of David around his neck, though that was the visible symbol everyone noticed, but also in his approach to music, to creativity, to understanding that beauty could emerge from pain and that survival often depended on unlikely alliances. The Jewish musical traditions he'd heard in the Karnoffsky home, the melodies and rhythms that carried centuries of persecution and persistence, found their way into his playing. The blues he created wasn't just African American, it was also shaped by the Eastern European minor keys, an emotional expressiveness he'd absorbed from the family that raised him. When his own family couldn't, in his autobiography, Louis wrote about the Karnoffskys with a tenderness he rarely showed in public. He described Bess's kindness, Morris's dignity, the feeling of being welcomed into a home when he'd never had a stable home of his own. He wrote about how they taught him that family wasn't just about biology, but about who showed up, who cared, who invested in your future when you had no reason to believe you had won. And he wrote about the cornet, that $5 instrument that became his voice, his livelihood, his contribution to human culture. The Karnoffskys gave him that, not because they expected anything in return, but because they believed that a child's potential was worth investing in regardless of what that child looked like or where he'd come from. The Star of David Louis wore wasn't a religious conversion. He remained Baptist his entire life. It was a declaration of loyalty, of gratitude, of recognition that his life had been shaped by people who didn't have to care about him, but chose to anyway. When reporters would ask about it, especially later in his career when he was famous and such choices carried weight, Louis would explain about the Karnoffskys. Sometimes he would add that he wore it to remind himself that hatred and division weren't inevitable, that the boundaries society constructed could be crossed, that love and family could exist between people who were supposed to be separated. Morris and Bess Karnoffsky never became wealthy. They continued their junk collection business, continued to struggle financially, continued to face discrimination for being Jewish in a Christian-dominated South. They never sought recognition for helping Louis. Didn't contact him when he became famous, didn't ask for money or favors or acknowledgement. They had helped a child because a child needed help and they had the means to provide it, however limited those means were. That was the extent of their calculation, but Louis never forgot. He would send them money over the years, would visit when he came through New Orleans, would introduce them to reporters as the people who had saved his life. The story of Louis Armstrong and the Karnoffsky family challenges the simplistic narratives we often tell about race, about charity, about who helps whom and why. It refuses to fit neatly into categories. It's not about white benefactors and black recipients because the Karnoffskys were marginalized themselves, because the help flowed in multiple directions, because the relationship was mutual rather than hierarchical. It's not about overcoming racism through individual kindness, because the structural racism that made both the Karnoffskys and Louis vulnerable continued unchanged. One family's decision to help one child didn't transform the system that oppressed millions, but it did transform that child. It gave Louis Armstrong not just a musical instrument, but a model of what human beings could be to each other when they chose connection over division. It showed him that the hatred he encountered, the discrimination that told him his life was worth less than white lives, wasn't universal or inevitable. That there were cracks in the system, spaces where different rules applied, moments when people chose each other across the boundaries they were supposed to respect. And that knowledge, that experience, shaped everything Louis became. Today, the Karnoffsky family is a footnote. In most Louis Armstrong biographies, a brief mention of the family that bought him his first cornet, the Star of David he wore, is noted, usually without much explanation of its significance. The depth of the relationship, the complexity of what it meant for a Jewish family and a black child to build family in 1908 New Orleans, gets compressed into a paragraph or ignored entirely. Perhaps because the story doesn't fit our current frameworks for discussing race and power. Perhaps because it suggests that the past was more complicated than we want it to be, that people found ways to love each other that transcended the categories we think were absolute. But Louis never forgot. In his final years, when he was the most famous jazz musician in the world, when presidents and royalty sought his company, he would still tell stories about Morris and Bess Karnoffsky. About the meals Bess cooked, about Morris's patience and dignity, about the home they gave him when he had none, about the $5 cornet that became worth millions, not in monetary terms but in what it enabled, the music it allowed him to create, the voice it gave him when the world was trying to silence people who looked like him. He would touch the Star of David around his neck and say that it reminded him where he came from, who had believed in him first, who had shown him that family could be chosen and that kindness could cross any boundary if people were brave enough to try. The white family nobody talks about, Morris and Bess Karnoffsky, Russian Jewish immigrants who fled one kind of persecution and found themselves facing another, who recognized in a 7-year-old black child something of their own struggle, who chose to help when helping carried risk when their own survival was precarious, when society told them that the lines dividing people were absolute and crossing them was dangerous. They chose connection anyway. They chose to see Louis not as a category but as a child, not as someone else's problem but as their responsibility. And that choice, that simple human choice to care about another person's hunger and potential, changed music history. But more importantly, it changed Louis Armstrong's understanding of what was possible. It gave him a foundation of love and support that he would build on for the rest of his life. It taught him that the world was more complicated than the simple stories of hatred and division, that there were always people willing to cross boundaries, to build bridges, to choose humanity over the categories that were supposed to contain it. And when Louis became famous, when he faced pressure to stay silent about racism, to avoid controversy, to just smile and play his trumpet and not challenge the status quo, he remembered the Karnoffskys, remembered that they hadn't stayed silent when they saw a child suffering, remembered that they hadn't accepted the social order that said he wasn't their concern, remembered that the bravest thing you could do was care about people you weren't supposed to care about and help people you weren't supposed to help. Around his neck, for most of his adult life, Louis Armstrong wore a Star of David, a symbol of a family that had given him more than a musical instrument. They had given him proof that love could exist across any divide, that family could be built from choice rather than blood, that the categories society used to separate people could be refused by anyone brave enough to refuse them. The Karnoffskys and Louis Armstrong, a Russian Jewish family and a black child, in 1908 New Orleans, creating family where family wasn't supposed to exist, proving that sometimes the most revolutionary thing you can do is simply care about another human being when the world says you shouldn't. That's the story nobody talks about, but it's the story Louis never forgot. It's the story he wore around his neck, close to his heart, for the rest of his life.